Hello, my name is Bahnassi, and we'll be talking today about pharmacovigilance in this difficult times. I'm glad you can join us on this Saturday. Depending on your country of residence, it could be afternoon, could be evening. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Please let us know if you're there. As I said, this is Anas Bahnassi, and I'll be talking to you today about pharmacovigilance in times of crisis and how we can keep the drug safety alive and vivid in these days. All right, let's start. The beginning will ask all of you if you can actually get involved in this quiz. All right, so please let me know if you're there. We'll just give it a second or so, making sure more people are able to join us. All right, so as I see, many people are getting into professions and careers in regulatory affairs, in drug safety. Things are more of less usual careers. So my question would start here is, are you considering a career in pharmacovigilance? Are you currently considering a career in pharmacovigilance? Are you already working in pharmacovigilance? I would appreciate it if you can actually participate in the poll. So if you're already working in pharmacovigilance or regulatory affairs, let us know, please. If you're just curious about the topic, that's also fine. And if you're interested in this as a profession of future, please feel free to let us know as well. All right. So many changes are actually happening that are requiring different demands of the pharmacovigilance system. A very major change is related to the pharmaceutical industry itself. So the pharmaceutical industry as itself has changed. We are used in the past of having a big pharmaceutical companies providing all the conventional medications that we're familiar with. However, these things are actually a little different now. What's happening right now is more smaller startup companies are starting to show on the surface. Like one of the statistics that I found lately in the United States, I think around 650 of these startup pharmaceutical companies are coming into place. These are trying to bridge the gap of biotechnology and genomics. And we see a lot of new companies actually, like a new big pharmaceutical companies. What they are doing is they are buying a products that was already invented by independent labs or small startup companies and take all the marketing responsibilities. So these changes are actually pretty obvious and they're showing in the market now. And that's why it's reflecting the way how we look at drug safety and how we look about issues of pharmacovigilance. So this gap is being bridged. However, remember, the small startup companies don't have the same type of capabilities that the huge big pharma do, and that will make a big difference this way. It's a different setting, different way of installing their departments of pharmacovigilance. So that's actually is requiring extra challenges and more challenges that are related to the matter. If we look at the top 10 medications that were marketed and sold in the United States over the last 2 years, we will see that most of these products were actually developed and created by smaller companies or by labs However, they were marketed by big pharmaceutical companies. They were bought and marketed by big pharmaceutical companies. So there is this kind of gap in between that many of the systems are trying to actually fulfill and trying to bridge. Let's visit what we mean by pharmacovigilance in the first place. For people who are just enthusiastic about the matter and want to learn about pharmacovigilance, it's basically the science that holds behind the activities of the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse events. And not only this, another thing was added basically, and we're talking about drug-related problems or things that are related to the use of this medication, which is like the unwanted effects of these drugs and these medications. It's also now becoming more of a broader venue for people to explore and to talk about, and that's why it creates a little bit more of challenges. In times of crisis, as you can see, and we've actually witnessed over the course of the few months that just passed with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of companies are rushing into new vaccines, into new medications, or the use of older medications for the treatment of the emerging virus. This is actually creating more of an issue in regard to the safety of the medications. Safety of medications should always be a priority, and that's something that we need to remember to do all the time. So it's a matter of keeping that as a priority always, and sometimes we forget that. And one good example, if we remember, about the use of the hydroxychloroquine and how it was actually marketed in a way for prophylaxis. Even we heard the President of the United States actually talking about the use of hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis against the COVID-19 pandemic with no real scientific background to support these claims. And later on, many actually associations and departments across the world have actually dropped the use of hydroxychloroquine due to safety issues. Another thing, actually, during these days, it's a great opportunity to actually make sure that we can talk among different pharmacovigilance systems and the healthcare systems, like how we can actually implement a good and viable pharmacovigilance system within national health systems. There is a big issue that we can see in regard to the communication. It's becoming really hard, this communication now, and we see it's during the pandemic, it's actually getting really harder with more people are getting into these issues as well. Another thing is we've seen even among very developed countries, countries with lots and tons of resources, we find that they were not quite ready and they didn't have the satisfactory performance in actually answering to the pandemic and this crisis. So that raised another flag about how our current pharmacovigilance systems are working and whether they are actually prepared to kind of answer or respond to such crises. What you actually need of a pharmacovigilance system? It's an important thing to actually think about pharmacovigilance system as a system that's able to handle quite a bit and interpret in the same time quite a bit of information. It's an ongoing stream of information, and believe it or not, these days we are actually getting more sources of information. Social media is one of them, about what are the unwanted effects, how we are actually perceiving drugs and the use of medications. And the system needs to handle a lot of these medications, and many of this information that is provided is actually not relevant or might not actually produce kind of a significant information to the system, yet they need to be counted and they need to be analyzed. Another thing that we need to do is to be prepared to actually respond to all the requirements of different international systems around the world. Like now, every country has its own national pharmacovigilance system, and I know each pharmaceutical company is actually planning to market their medications in more than one country. Accordingly, they need to respond to the different regulatory requirements that are available in all of these countries, which is a matter of very importance as well. Another thing is the timelines that we have. There are many time frames that this business requires, and accordingly, it's a kind of ongoing process with a high level of routine and time requirements and regulatory requirements that needs to be addressed as well. So that makes the pharmacovigilance system is really hard to make a pharmacovigilance system that is quite responsive to all these points all together and being viable to provide good safety information for the pharmaceutical companies to be actually marketed in the same place at the same time. There's a big challenge. People who work in pharmacovigilance systems and they work in pharmacovigilance careers, they know for sure that there is a lot of information that's coming to them, and they need to identify the signals from their patients, see if they can be able to actually provide this information. In the same time, they want to make sure that irrelevant information that comes and might actually trigger alarms, they don't get counted. And that's another big challenge that many companies and many personnel in that regard are facing as well. So that's something that they need to actually learn about and know about as well. With the coronavirus, if we see most of the medications, whether they were older medications or they were newer medications, they mostly are being done by startup companies. And we mentioned with the startup companies, we don't have enough time to actually address all the different deficiencies in our pharmacovigilance systems. Many pharmacovigilance systems in these smaller companies are not even adequate or ready to handle this volume and this amount of information. That's one thing. The other thing is that a lot of issues are already there at the time of approval, especially when are we doing certain medications at an emergency level. Like many medications get exceptional approvals and they come with a long list of safety concerns that needs to be addressed after these medications are being marketed. And the third and another important thing is being able to manage all this information and handle all these activities post-marketing level after this medication is already in the market with all the deficiencies that we mentioned. And remember that many medications that come out due to emergency pandemics or unusual diseases, they come because there aren't enough medications in the market, and that's why they come with a lot of safety concerns that needs to be addressed later, and that's something that needs to be taken into consideration as well. There is a big problem and a lot of weaknesses that are in the current data management. First of all, we have some vulnerabilities in our operation system. And if you think about it, most of these smaller companies or startup companies, what they do is they actually try to contract other research contractors, like other organizations, to do a lot of the work for them, especially like the data collection or the data analysis. And sometimes this might have a communication problem between the two systems and may actually cause on the long term a problem that might actually affect the value of the information collected. There's a lot of turnover in pharmacovigilance systems in many of these companies, whether they are contracting companies or the actual manufacturing companies. And that's kind of result in a lot of loss in institutional knowledge. There's a lot of manual work that includes a lot of archiving and a lot of work that's done manually that's also cause a lot of issues in the possibility of human error and possibility of unable to handle the huge number of information that's being provided all the time. Let's go for a quiz. Do you believe that the current pharmacovigilance system that you're familiar with is actually able to detect reliable signals, or do you think that you're just filling forms? If you can actually provide some answers, that will be great. So it's either yes or no. Do you think that what we have right now as a pharmacovigilance system, is it capable of providing reliable signals that can help in renewing the safety information for these medications, or you think that's not quite the case? All right, so the next part we'll go to is who is really needed to actually go into this system. There is a lot of needs for high profile pharmacovigilance talent. A couple days ago, I actually took a look at the LinkedIn jobs, and I was trying to look for a director level position in pharmacovigilance. My search in the United States turned to 560 vacant positions at the director level for pharmacovigilance departments. Out of this, over 100 were in the states of Massachusetts and New York alone, where we have most of the biotech companies. There are a lot of these positions that are left unfilled, and that's a problem. And let me tell you why could that be. I actually took an extra further step and actually tried to see what's the job requirements and what are the things that they are needed. So I read the job description, and many required years in a specific area of clinical work, whether it's like a kind of a medical professionals with like a clinician degree and stuff like that. And I know this will actually make it difficult and make it harder to fit people profiles to find this level of experience and this level of education. There is a lot of positions right now are available, and they are ready for people to take if they have the right training, if they are able to actually respond to this exact requirements. And a lot of people don't realize that what we really need now is not to follow the big pharma model of pharmacovigilance departments. We need actually to go after these smaller contracting companies that are allowed to adapt to different needs of the startup companies. There is another important that might make these kind of positions not very attractive to people. And I believe some of these is related to career advancement. And the career advancement is mostly achieved when people change from one company to another. However, basically when this is happening, there is a lot of key positions that are being filled of people who do not have the right experience just because they have a nice resume. So another thing that needs to be taken into consideration actually is to make sure that whenever we are actually hiring for this higher level of positions is to hire from within the company. That's actually better because a lot of these people actually are familiar with the company culture and they learn a lot about the different fields and clinical fields that the company work in. So another actually quiz right now, if you can help me get some answers here. Do you believe that moving in general, not necessarily in pharmacovigilance, do you believe that moving from one company to another is your best way to advance in your career? I'll give it a few seconds here. Do you think that you really want to go and to another company to be able to move higher in the company? or you believe that no, it's actually staying in the same company will get you the advancement that you need in your in your career dreams? That's another question. All right, so apparently some people do really believe that they really need to go to a different company for them to get a director position or a management position. And many of these people actually are going into smaller companies and outsourcing companies. And what is exactly happening there is eventually these people are going into a smaller, less experienced companies, helping to get a higher rank. And what's happening in the actual pharmaceutical companies, they have less and less pool of talents. So they are pushing their pharmacovigilance business into another outsourcing companies. This is making a big gap between the pharmacovigilance inspection, where the original company needs to inspect the work of the contractor or the CRO, and there are too many reasons why could that be the reason. One of them is because there is like a different systems, there could be different goals, different objectives of the different companies, and that's actually creating some issues. Another thing, it's basically make it harder to make sure that the new drug application or the marketing authorization application get there to the authorities on time, because there's a lot of gaps in between the big pharmaceutical company and the little smaller companies as well. There's an increase in numbers of companies with lacking talents in that pool, and that's basically making this company mostly towards the medical and the scientific part in the manufacturing companies, rather than actually doing it as a in-house, which is another very important issue as well. So what's happening right now? Many companies are failing to invest in a strong pharmacovigilance system. And that's actually a problem, because maybe they do not realize, but that's actually is delaying their approval process. And it may actually have their applications missing some very important information. Another thing that we need to take into consideration, that their label for the newly approved product might have unnecessary safety information. This unnecessary safety information may first limit the marketing of the medication and provide maybe inaccurate information to the end user. And this is a very important thing. Like, you're rushing into things, you're forgetting to put the full information, and sometimes you have to put information that's not necessarily confirmed just because you didn't have the time to actually test it and analyze it, and that's end up in a problem on the long run. Another thing, it may actually cause some inspection issues, and this inspection issues might result in a bad image and negative effect on the company itself and reduce its overall marketing value. That's why it's very important to invest in that pharmacovigilance system. Make sure you have a strong pharmacovigilance department that help you in the very early points of actually making your medication available to the regulatory authorities, so you end up with more solid information that help you market that product on the long run. Another thing is about the investment. Where am I going to do my investment? The investment need to be, first of all, must be continuously updated, because we have new sources of information. We have new technologies that can help us handle these sources of information. So making sure that we continuously update this is a very important. Being able to online reporting, implant requirements. I have some experience with national programs in Middle Eastern countries. I'm not going to name them, but the only issue was in these countries to establish a national pharmacovigilance program is being able to actually speak to the online reporting requirement of the WHO and the other agencies across the world. Another thing that we need to do is we make sure that we will be able to respond to all different adverse events that might appear. So a lot of publicly available information right now that can come into publication, they might show in the news. The system needs to be able to answer to this to avoid any negative image that publicly can affect the company, and not just that product, maybe a lot of other products in the future too. So a strong pharmacovigilance system can help answer to this information and answer to all these negative media that might be created because of that as well. Again, if we can go to a quick one, see if you are actually here with us. Do you believe that rushing a drug into a market with weak pharmacovigilance system can, on the long run, negatively affect the company image? What do you think? If you can, please participate. That will be nice of you. So a lot of companies now are rushing a lot of drugs into the market without being capable of having a strong system. Would you think that's on the long run that will cause issues? Tell the truth, I believe yes. I truly believe it's a yes. And a lot of people actually, I think, agree with me, because we've seen that in many medications over the history, that a lot of medications were rushed into the market. And what happened in they got withdrawn, a lot of lawsuits, ended up with a lot of problems, and affected the actual image of the company itself. So that's something that needs to be actually kept into consideration as well. All right, so let's take another look at what happens when we actually just deal with pharmacovigilance as a cost. A lot of companies look at this department. This is just a regulatory requirement department that all what it does, it's costing us money. So how we can save on that? Big pharmaceutical companies will say, let's actually outsource this whole task to a different country, another location that's less costly, and we don't have to worry about it. Okay. But all this information that's being collected in this outsourced location, in this other company, who are gonna be analyzing this, and who's gonna make the final decision about the validity of this information? It's the mother company, it's the pharmaceutical company. And unfortunately, because most of the time we do lack like the actual prepared and talents in pharmacovigilance departments, we rely on our medical teams in our risk management departments to find if this information are valid. And what's happening accordingly, there's a separation between who is assessing individual adverse reactions, adverse effects reports, and who is analyzing them in a bulk. So the outsourcing companies is actually looking at individual cases and saying this is valid, this is not valid, this is adds to this, while the actual entity that's analyzing them all as total is a totally different department, which is located into the mother pharmaceutical company, a different thing. That's actually creating a lot of confusion. And what's happening is the mother companies are losing more and more of talented pharmacovigilance professionals, because for some of the companies think it's just an added cost, and for a lot of them it's actually all this information that they got from the outsourced company, they are not being able to analyze and get a real safety information that they can share with the rest of the world. How can we measure pharmacovigilance for professional? What do you think? That's another problem. That's a lot of issues with when people are working in this department. They're saying, if I am a pharmacovigilance professional and I work in a pharmacovigilance department, how will my boss measure my performance? Will they say because we comply more? Because I'm able to do better data management? Because I detect more signals, or others? People who actually work in that field, if you can give me some insight about how do you guys think that your performance is being measured by your bosses? Do you think that it's measured that you are actually meeting all the timelines that are required by the regulatory authorities in your countries? Or do you think it's because you're collecting more data and you're actually able to categorize this data better? Or you believe that it's just because you are detecting more signals? Or maybe you have other way of being measured for your performance? A lot of people say that, like I saw one of the answers that says data management and signal detection. But the problem is with that, it's actually it's actually a negative thing. Like, think about it this way. When you think about data management and signal detection, it's basically something bad that this medication does. So sometimes a lot of people who work in this department, they're thinking, is it really good to show the bad things that this medication is doing? Or is it better to actually just make the compliance is the biggest thing? Or do I really need to be very sure when I say I did actually detect a signal? Like, it's a lot of things that are related to that. And really, it's really nice to actually discuss this. So let's take a look. Many people now are thinking of pharmacovigilance as a less desirable as a career. What do you think? Is that true? Like, do you feel like it still has a desirable in the countries where you reside right now, that still people really want to pursue a kind of this career? That's one thing. The other thing is high demand. There's a high demand for changing requirements. If you look at the countries and the inspection requirements of these countries, they are changing on a regular basis. They are changing every day, every month. And if you are in a multinational companies and you are responsible of many markets, you will see this regulatory requirements are being changed constantly. There is always an expectation of 100% compliance. And I actually looked at all the violations that were cited in the United States over the last 2 years, 2018, 2019. And interestingly, 98% of these violations are related to compliance issues. So it's not really the patient safety that's number one here. It's basically how compliant we are with the regulatory authorities that we answer to. This is a very big deviation from the actual objective of a pharmacovigilance program. The pharmacovigilance program's objective is not really meant to just be compliant with regulatory authorities. It's meant to protect the public. How much of your signal detection is really providing some new safety information? How much do we care as pharmaceutical companies, as marketers, to actually provide accurate and updated information to our users, to our end users? There is the mentality of how I will reward my employees in the pharmacovigilance department. What is considered measure for success of a pharmacovigilance personnel? That's a big question that a lot of companies need to answer to. And I see it's a matter of when you work with regulatory affairs, when you work with like safety issues, it's very important to be able to be a good analyzer. So I truly believe there are big need to reset certain new measurements, new factors to measure people abilities for not just for compliance, but for ability to analyze all this data and differentiate the good and the bad data. Many people will think if I'm going to provide more signals, I'll be perceived as a negative employee. This guy who is like the um, whistler, like always say, oh, there's something wrong. I don't want to be that guy. Or another thing is, let's just stick to compliance and make sure we don't get any citation from the FDA or the EMA or from the ministries of health in our countries. But is it really that what we really want to do? So it's becoming more of a questioning thing in our minds, trying to see what's really better for the post, what's really better for the company, and what's really better for our end patient. So one thing is, a lot of people now are getting less attracted and they're going more into different jobs. But you know what? We can actually, exactly, someone actually told me it's a whistleblowers. We really don't want to be whistleblowers. We really want to be the people who are in the middle, like who really work taking into consideration the company values and the company benefits as well, our other stakeholders like the patients. So one important thing that we need to restructure in our departments, in our pharmacovigilance departments, is actually stressing on long-term training and high level of education. If you think about it, it's a very important thing, especially in this department. The reason why there is a lot of technologies that can be adopted. There's constantly new sources of information that need to be taken into consideration. And accordingly, our teams need to be always prepared and trained to undertake all these challenges. There is a need to be able to show a clear path to our employees in these departments of how they were going to grow in their careers and how their career pathway looks like. And in many companies, this is not quite clear. Smaller companies that they don't have time or the resources for hiring programs should again consider hiring contractors, not really outsourcing all the work, but hiring contractors so they can train their own employees to be able to build the basics for such departments. And I think that's very important. And many companies are just like overseeing that, and they're just not quite aware of the importance. And I mentioned, like in a couple of slides ago, how important it is to actually be able to have a strong pharmacovigilance department. What's happening right now is, as I mentioned, more smaller companies are the ones who are bringing all the new medications to the market. They want to outsource processing of all the reports they get. They want to even outsource the detection of the signals that may arise of these reports, and even the risk management. They really want to manage that. If they can outsource it, they probably will do as well. Who they really outsource it to? They're outsourcing it because they want to have economies that provide less cost for them. One of the things. They want to try to get more global reach by actually reaching companies all across the world who might have international experience that they may lack. And they don't want to hire. They want to actually circumvent the need to hire. They want to hire less people, and that's why they try to outsource. Is that really the best way to go? Well, experiences have showed us that this relationship might have a lot of contradictory goals and contradictory objectives that might not be as smooth as we think it will be. And the success is limited and can be limited by a fragmented outsourcing strategy. And what's happening right now is all what we need to do if we want really to work is to make sure that there is a conjoint training between the two companies, the original companies and the outsource, to have certain rules that they both can go, and we can try even match like employee from different companies to make sure everything is going directly or rightly the same way that it's supposed to. These are very important things about outsourcing. What's happening with Big Pharma? Big Pharma direct the CROs, the outsourced company, to do their processes and troubleshooting. They want to tell them to do it in certain ways. While small pharmaceutical companies, they use the expertise of these contractors to actually do on these. When they use all the expertise with very little experience of the small company itself, they end up with some decisions that might conflict with their own accountability. They have to actually adopt 100% what the CRO is telling them, and that's not always in the benefit or aligned with their objectives. That's the bad side about smaller companies. But even there's a bad side of the big pharma company, because a lot of big pharma companies, the people who dictate are usually people who are very strong in the medical information. They are not as strong in the processing and analysis of data. And that's why there's a lot of misdirections to the CRO, and that end up eventually with a future crisis and a lot of detrimental effects on the business as total. And that's actually something that we need to consider very, very well before we hire someone else to do our pharmacovigilance work. So outsourcing, it's fixing that system can be resource intensive. Yes, we know that. If you want to fix your own system, it's not going to be cheap. Another thing, if you are inconsistent in standards between the CRO and the original companies, it will direct to many problems in the future that contradict the actual goal of saving money. Now you're going to be spending more money later because you have contradictory objectives and you don't have like matching process between the two. Another thing is if you fully outsourced your pharmacovigilance systems, that's will be really hard for really maybe needed for smaller companies, but on one condition, that we are actually hiring a small CRO to, that we can actually work very smoothly with their personnel and with their corporate people, so we can actually have a good and continuous conversation about the matter. Cost and productivity, let me tell you, it's very costly. So for example, just to let you know, to gather one adverse drug reaction, it costs over $100,000. But this $100,000 might not even actually result in a serious adverse events that we can actually report on our safety sheet. Another thing is the cost is rising every year. Just last year, we reached $5.1 billion, the cost of PV systems around the world. The cost of bringing in new medication, like a single medication, is $1.4 billion now, it's averaging. And if you look at the recommendation of how we should actually conduct our pharmacovigilance system, the WHO is actually asking to count the number of deaths, hospitalizations that are due to adverse drug reactions. Is that really logical for a company that's trying to promote and market their medication? That's actually a big thing. And that's why many companies and many professionals in the pharmacovigilance systems need to step in and provide another input of how we can measure drug safety. Good pharmacovigilance practices in Europe actually anticipate companies to measure the effectiveness of products, risk mitigation activities. How are you going to measure that? Although they tell you to measure it, they don't really provide you of a real and reliable method to measure it. And eventually what happens is all what we're measuring against is compliance. Are we responding to the requirements and the questions of the regulatory authority? Yes, we're good. No, needs improvement. But it's not as simple as that. And the reason why we're not actually providing our own input as pharmacovigilance professionals into that arena, which is, I think, is quite needed. It's an enormous investment with a very low yield. Just Roche Genentech, for one medication, 80,000 adverse events were received and did not change the safety profile for this medication a single bit, because they were all irrelevant information. There's a lot of cost involved to actually make just a little change, but this little change is quite necessary on the long-term use and marketing of this medication. Why are we having this high cost and low productivity? First, the low yield. The criteria to actually getting a new report, it's very, very simple. We just need an identifiable prescriber, identifiable patient, identifiable medication, identifiable adverse drug reaction, and identifiable effect to actually just file one. So just think about the millions of reports that being filed on a regular basis. Another thing is the follow-up is really hard to follow up on all of these reports to make sure that they are valid, they provide like a significant change. And one important thing also is that an individual case report rarely establish any change or any casualty. And many times, unfortunately, our pharmacovigilance department only works to fill the spaces in the reports that they need to send to the regulatory authorities. But that's not really our job, is it? Processing and interpreting this large volume of information is not easy, and it actually involves a huge margin of error, although we are required to have a very little margin of error. So what's the solution? How we can do that? One of the very thing is to actually look at the process, how we are doing things right now. So we receive this individual case reports, either by phone, by fax, by mail or email, and we manually enter all this. When we manually do all this, so there are many points that limit our work: the recruitment, retention, training, supervision of the personnel who is doing this, creation of maintenance mechanism for the quality of management system, and the continuous preparedness of inspections that we are able to do. This can be resolved by automation. Automation will provide us with artificial intelligence that will provide all the logarithms that are able to kind of respond to different reports. And even if we can't create a logarithm in the first place, we can rely on machine learning. And with machine learning, it's basically a process that our computers can learn to create a pattern from different reports. And finally, the blockchain, which basically making sure of the categorization of the information, would provide some integrity to the information that we are getting. And that's a very important thing on the long run to make sure that this blocks that we created have any valid value on the long term or not. Our final question for today: do you believe that automation might actually affect your work? It may result in loss of certain jobs in the PV department, or it actually will free you to provide a more analytical task that are much needed for that career in the first place. What's your stand on automation in pharmacovigilance? It will be interesting to know some of your feedback, if you have any. All right. So let's finally take a look about what we need to know out of this presentation. First of all, the careers in pharmacovigilance are going under duress. They are going under certain stress. Talent shortfall need to be addressed. We don't have enough talents because a lot of these talents are not following the new model. They're still stuck in the big pharma model, which is not quite used anymore. Current emphasis is on compliance versus on patient safety, and that should not be the case. Another thing that's very important is we are working now just to fill for the regulatory requirements than when we fill for the actual objective or keeping the public safe. Long-term plan for automation might be necessary to shift the focus of our personnel from data entry, from data handling and data management to actually be more able to test the safety and efficacy of our medications. This was my presentation for the day. I provided some of the contact information. I'll be happy to hear from you. We also are running some like long-term and short-term courses of pharmacovigilance on the Clin Academy website, where you're welcome to join us in one of these courses. And I'll be able to help with questions. Please feel free if you have any questions at the end of this presentation to provide it, and I'll try to answer to the best if there is any questions. If you like to share some of your thoughts, I'll be happy to hear of your thoughts too. But other than that, if you are okay, let me know as well. All right. I hear good thanks. I appreciate your listening, and hopefully that wasn't a long 50 minutes. We got a lot of information in a very short time. I hope that the information that we provided were easily to digest. I hope that it created some of the questions, some of the decisions that you want to make about your careers, whether you are already in the pharmacovigilance department or you're thinking about getting into that department. Thank you very much. I will end the broadcast for now, but please, if